Good afternoon, grade 12s, and welcome to our first History Telematics session for 2021. I'd like to warmly congratulate you on reaching grade 12, and I'm sure that you're excited for the academic journey that faces you this year. So in order to assist you and ensure that you produce the best results that you possibly can for this year for history, I would like to always warmly invite you to join our telematics sessions when we host them. In today's telematics session, we are going to be focusing on the origins of the Cold War, and we're going to focus on some content over there, and then we're also going to have to look at the application of skills for our source-based section of work. After we've completed that section, we're going to touch on Vietnam. But there's so much work for us to complete today that we won't be able to go into Vietnam in detail. So we're just going to have a look at the application of skills for essay writing with regards to our introductions. In another session, when you join us, grade 12s for history, we'll have a look at building the line of argument and also having a look at writing the conclusions for your essays. So, without any further ado, let's get started with our PowerPoint. Right, so already, grade 12, you can see over there, I'm warning you about something, and I want us to be very clear about the warning. The warning relates to the fact that in 2021, we are going to have revised content. So there is a revised content focus alert for grade 12 history in 2021. This means that you cannot refer to the past exam papers for the last few years. Usually I would say 2017 to 2020. You must not refer to exam papers or previous telematics videos from this period because our content focus for grade 12 history in 2021 has changed. So you must please look out for the fresh information and content that telematics will produce in order to assist you this year. So now that I've warned you about that, let's get on to the origins of the Cold War. Let's have a brief overview of what must actually take place when we are looking at the origins of the Cold War. So we know that it's a source-based section of work. Your teachers would have told you this already. And when we have a look at the broad content overview for the section, the origins of the Cold War, you are going to study the foreign policies and terms that the various countries produced during the Cold War, usually the USA and the USSR's foreign policies of that period. Then you're also going to look at some case studies that relate to the origins of the Cold War, namely one of the crises in Berlin, the Blockade as well as the Airlift. And then there's another crisis that happens in Berlin that's very popular, and that is the building of the Berlin Wall in 1961. So those are our main focus areas for the section of work, but it does not mean that you must not know the other information. We have to study and know all our information, but these are the main focus areas. An area that you don't have to pay too much attention to grade 12 will be the area on the Cuban Missile Crisis. So if you have a look at past telematics productions that we did, or if you have a look at past exam papers, you will see we paid a lot of attention to the focus area of the Cuban Missile Crisis. But that is definitely not the focus area for 2021. So as you prepare for your formal assessments, your school-based assessments at school, and the final exams, because that's our ultimate goal, please bear in mind that you do not need to focus on the Cuban Missile Crisis. We know this information because there's a document that is produced and it's called the exam guidelines. Each subject produces exam guidelines, right? So now we know that we are going to have a new set of exam guidelines for history. That document hasn't been released to the public yet, and we are waiting for it. And then when it's released, it will be shared with your teachers, and your teachers will go through that document with you in class at school. So always ask your teacher, I would say on a weekly basis now, ask them if that exam guidelines document has come out so that you know where to focus when you are preparing for your formal assessment tasks. Okay, let's continue now. So when we have a look at the origins of the Cold War, we know that we really have two competing strong countries, right? And in your telematics booklet, you have been asked to identify the very basics. So the one basic you've been asked to identify is by looking at that flag of the country, we must identify our various countries at play over here. So the one country on the left, and you'll see I've marked it in blue, is the United States of America. When we are asked to identify the ideology or the ideologies that they practice, it makes sense for us to say that America practices capitalist democracy, all right? And then if we try to understand what the sense means, if we're making meaning of it, then it would be the idea that it's an economic system based on private ownership rather than government ownership. And politically, the leaders are elected, all right? All of this is in sharp contrast to what appears on the right of our screen. With regards to the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, we find that the dominant ideology over there is communism. When we make sense and meaning of it, we say that it's an economic system based on government ownership and control of resources. There is economic equality amongst the people because there's this general idea of sharing the nation's wealth, and politically the country is ruled as a one-party state. And so we find that people's individual freedoms are limited in communist countries. So these are the two major role players when we look at the origins of the Cold War, because we know that after World War II they emerge as the superpowers of the world. When you have a look at your telematics booklet, you'll notice that there are various exercises for us to do. One has a look at understanding the various concepts and also looking at historical events that occur. So we're just going to go through answering the various examples that have come up in your telematics booklet. Now, one that doesn't appear in the telematics booklet is a definition for the Cold War, or an explanation for the Cold War. I know your teachers would have covered this with you, but I thought it was important that we just start today's session by looking at an explanation of the Cold War. So on our screen over here, we can see that the Cold War is the period of tension between the capitalist democracies of the Western world, so that's the USA and all of their allies, and the communist countries of Eastern Europe. Right? This was a war of ideologies, and we know that when we speak about a war of ideologies, ideologies relates to ideas. So it's the very ideas that are clashing, namely capitalism and democracy and communism. All right? The West, we know, was led by the United States of America, and then we know that the Eastern European countries were led by the Soviet Union. Although the two superpowers never officially declared war on each other, so we say that the war never became hot, it remains a Cold War between the USA and the USSR, right? They do fight indirectly in proxy wars. When we talk about proxy wars, we can think of our example that actually comes from the Vietnam War. So you don't have the USA and the USSR fighting and clashing directly with each other. Rather, they fight via proxy wars, so they are providing support and aid to other countries that are involved in wars in this period. All right, let's go on. You'll see over here, I've also included some words that I want you to look out for when you do the section of work. One of the words that we speak about quite often and most commonly is describing the period of tension between the USA and the USSR, or capitalism and communism. But it might not only be the word tension. We can also look out for words like the suspicion between the countries, or we can refer to the distrust between the countries, or we can refer to the mistrust between the countries as well. So you'll notice, grade 12, that it's very important for us to have a good understanding of the terminology and the words that can come up in our history assessments. Now let's have a look at the Iron Curtain. When we speak about the Iron Curtain, grade 12, it's so important for us to realize that the Iron Curtain is not a physical curtain, right? The Berlin Wall is a physical wall. It is a physical structure that stands there. But the Iron Curtain is a symbolic border. It's the symbolic border or divide between the communist and democratic countries of Europe. The idea was that it kept information and people from crossing from the communist East to the democratic West. And for the purpose of visualizing and understanding the information that we're working with, I've included a map over here to show you. All right? So the countries that are in dark, deep red include Russia, right? And then all of the territories that it had annexed after World War II. The territories that are in the lighter shade of red, the pink countries, refer to their satellite states, right? Countries that were under their influence, not necessarily under their direct control, but definitely fell within their sphere of influence. Now we're going to go on to the idea of containing the spread of communism. So the USA has to introduce a set of foreign policies or a foreign policy. Everything within this period falls under the policy of containment, right? So the policy of containment is the United States foreign policy, right? That basically says that they will not trust any communist governments, and that they also believe that if they are able to prevent the spread of communism, so if they can contain communism, prevent it from spreading, then they believe that communist governments will eventually fall apart and will no longer be able to influence the world. So within the policy of containment, you have various other policies and plans, the most common ones being the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. So if you had a look at your telematics booklet, you know it would have asked us to explain those as well. So under the Truman Doctrine, the Truman Doctrine was an effort to stop the spread of communism. It said that the United States would help countries that were threatened by the Soviet Union or communist forces. When we speak about the help that's being offered, it was essentially economic and military help that was offered to governments that wanted to ensure that they would block communist forces and ensure that communist rebels could not take over their governments as such. Now let's touch on the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan, grade 12s, was aimed at the economic recovery in Europe at the time. According to the Marshall Plan, they essentially promoted economic aid. They were willing to offer all sorts of aid in terms of offering food supplies, fertilizers, rebuilding the infrastructure in Europe at the time, essentially anything that the European country would need at the time. So for the Marshall Plan, we say it's a US-sponsored program following World War II to aid European countries that had been destroyed as a result of the war. This European recovery program was not accepted by the Soviets or its satellite states. So at the time, the USA actually offered this plan to all democratic countries in Europe. They also offered the recovery plan to the satellite states that were under the influence of the Soviets. But the Soviet Union said that their countries would not accept the plan. The USA was accused of using dollar diplomacy. In simple terms, grade 12s, I think we can describe the term dollar diplomacy as the USSR accusing America of trying to buy friends and influence in Europe. Right? So that then covers our foreign policies of the Truman Doctrine, Marshall Plan, and that all falls under our policy of containment. We're now going to move on to some historical events. The first one I want us to take a look at is the Berlin Blockade. All right? So we know that after World War II, the West sent supplies to Berlin via railroads and roads, so all the surface routes. However, the Soviets wanted to control Berlin, and we know that Berlin was actually situated in their zone of occupation. So they figured or believed that if they cut off Berlin from the external supplies and food, then it would fall under their control, because the West would give up on sending supplies. So, on June the 24th, 1948, the Soviets blocked all surface routes, including rail and road traffic, as well as canals and waterways to Berlin. This meant that the West had to be more creative in terms of how they were going to send supplies to the city of Berlin. And so we know that they then implement the Berlin Airlift. So Western countries delivered much needed food and supplies to the city of Berlin through air, because all the surface routes were blocked by the Soviet Union. We also know that this Berlin Airlift lasts for close to 11 months, close to a year, right? And then eventually the Soviet Union gives up on the attempt of controlling Berlin. So earlier on, we spoke about the Iron Curtain, and we said that the Iron Curtain was not a real curtain, it was symbolic. And I said that we know that the Berlin Wall exists. The Berlin Wall is a physical wall, a real divide. And so the example that I've included over here clearly shows that the Berlin Wall is a physical presence. The Berlin Wall was built by the communist government of East Berlin in 1961. The wall separated East Berlin and West Berlin. It was built in order to prevent people from fleeing East Berlin. So grade 12s, this is what we want you to understand over here when it comes to Berlin. East Berlin was faced with a great challenge in the sense that you had a city that was divided into West Berlin, which was democratic, and East Berlin, which was under communist rule. And the people in East Berlin were not happy with their living conditions, their standard of living, and the fact that they experienced a lack of freedoms. Even though they were not allowed to vote in this country, you find that many of the people actually voted with their feet. So what do we mean when we say people voted with their feet? In short, the people of East Berlin showed their dissatisfaction with the communist rule in the city of East Berlin by fleeing the city, moving to West Berlin, or moving out of the country into other democratic countries in the area. This was a blow to the communist governments at the time because it clearly showed that the people in East Berlin did not want to live under communist rule. And so, in order to save the situation, they built this physical wall, saying that the people of East Berlin can no longer cross into West Berlin. So they are physically trying to keep the people behind that wall. But they don't tell the people of East Berlin that they are physically trying to keep them behind the wall. Instead, they say that they are protecting the people of East Berlin from the spies of the West. Right? Also, we know that it was a great disappointment to the government of East Berlin when people were fleeing, because the city was experiencing a brain drain. Young, skilled professionals were wanting to work in countries and in cities such as the city of Berlin, where they would have greater freedoms, a better standard of living, and where they would be paid for their skills. All right? Let's move on now. We also in class had a look at the Yalta conference and the Potsdam conference. So one of the things that we want to touch on is the idea of the difference between the Yalta and the Potsdam conferences, and just understand what had changed within European society at the time between the two conferences. So the one is the Yalta conference. It happens in February 1945 and it takes place in Russia. World War II had not ended yet. The main attendees at this Yalta conference are the Grand Alliance. So we said they meet in Yalta in the USSR. When we refer to the Grand Alliance, we are referring to Great Britain, the USA, and Russia. Their aim at the time was to decide what to do about Germany and German-controlled countries in Eastern Europe once the Nazis were defeated. So you'll see over here that at this stage, they've got the common enemy of Germany. It was agreed that Germany would be divided into zones of occupation, and countries in Eastern Europe would be allowed to hold free elections to determine the type of government that they want. Also in your telematics booklet, you were asked to identify the major role players that come up in this area. All right? So here you can see our major role players who were present at the Yalta conference. We've got the leader of Britain, Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister. Then we've got President Franklin Roosevelt, right, from the USA. And we also have the Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin. Right? So we said this session takes place before the end of World War II. Potsdam then takes place, and it's different in the sense that Potsdam takes place once Germany had been defeated. So it takes place between July and August 1945. In the end, the 4 zones of occupation in Germany had been decided. The Soviet Union would administer the Eastern Zone. The USA, Britain, and France would administer the 3 Western Zones. The city of Berlin, which was situated in the Soviet sector, would be divided into 4 sectors as well. Germany was to remain united. Economically, it was decided that they should work in cooperation with the long-term goal of keeping Germany as one country. The main difference, though, between Potsdam and Yalta, besides the fact that the one conference takes place before the end of the war and the other one takes place after the end of the war, that there was a change in leadership. Right. So if we look at the diplomatic dynamics, we find that Truman from the USA was now in power, right? And he was strongly anti-communist. We also know that Winston Churchill had stepped down as the leader in Britain, and that Attlee was in office. And he was relatively new in office. So grade 12s, if you look at those dynamics, it's interesting because Stalin is the only one who has really been around for a long period of time. Roosevelt had passed away in office, and so we say Truman comes into power, and he's strong anti-communist, much stronger than what Roosevelt has been. And so that starts to change the dynamics in terms of the diplomacy that we experience in Europe at the time. All right? So here I want us to start introducing the idea of perspective and Russian response. You'll notice that a great deal of what we've actually focused on has a look at America's response to the situation. But when we study history, we need to ensure that we look at multiple perspectives. And so it's so important for us to have an understanding of a Russian response within the period as well. All right. So if we have a look at the Russian response and the Russian perspective, in 1947, I need you to remember that Stalin sets up the Cominform, which is the Communist Information Bureau. Its aim was to coordinate the activities of Soviet satellites under the direction of the Soviet Union. You also have COMCON, the Council of Mutual Economic Aid, that was formed in 1949. Its aim was to coordinate the economic development of the Eastern European countries belonging to the Soviet bloc. Also, the USSR responded to the West formation of NATO. We know that NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, right? In response to the formation of NATO, they formed the Warsaw Treaty Organization, or the Warsaw Pact, in 1955. With its Eastern European satellites. The West saw these organizations as a means by which the Soviet Union could control Eastern Europe. You will also notice, grade 12s, that when you have a look at the West's policies that come out, such as the policy of containment, Truman Doctrine, and Marshall Plan, you usually find that the USSR and the East tend to bring out the official responses, the organizations, in response to what is already being carried out. So we've had a look at some of the main ideas, but I just want to remind you again that you need to ensure that you cover all your content. I have seen a paper in the past where the focus area was actually on the USSR and the organizations that they brought in response. And if we focus all of our energies on only understanding the American approach, then you'll find that your approach to studying history is unbalanced. So remember, we need to ensure that we are looking at multiple perspectives as we study the history to ensure that we understand everything. With that, I hope you have a better understanding of the content that we need to understand for the origins of the Cold War. And I now want us to have a look at the application of content through our skills-based work when we have a look at our source-based section. So very briefly today, we're going to have a look at one source and some, I consider them easy questions, some easy questions just to get you in the mood for studying history this year. So let's have a look at it. Right, so we said we're looking at our source-based application. Just a very important reminder when you start doing your source-based work that we need to focus on overcoming the challenge of language that we have. We know that many of our learners who do history often do history not necessarily in our home language, right? We are doing it in the language of teaching and instruction at our schools. And as we said, it's generally not our home language. So we need to make sure that when we get ready to write any history assessment, we study and we prepare ourselves. How do we prepare ourselves for an assessment, you might ask? We do this by reading and analyzing as many sources as possible from past papers. Now, I've already told you that you can't use the recent past papers Please remember that. I've told you can't use the recent past papers from 2017 to 2020. But when you are in class, your teacher will tell you a lovely trick about how you can look at past papers from the period of 2014 to 2016. So 2014, 2015, 2016, those 3 years. There are papers that you can have a look at over there, but please bear in mind that there are still changes to that grade 12 exam guidelines that don't necessarily apply. But I know for a fact that there are definitely sources on the origins of the Cold War in those papers that you can use to prepare for this section of work. Okay, so remember that tip. So we said you need to read and analyze many sources from past papers. You need to find the meanings of words that you don't understand. I know the habit that learners have. You want to just skip words that you don't understand. But what happens, grade 12s, is that all of those words that we skip, that we don't understand, they all start to add up and contribute to us not knowing our work effectively. So in order for us to learn effectively, we need to take and make use of these approaches. We need to understand the content and the context of each source. We need to make sure that we read the contextualization. The contextualization is so important, grade 12s, because it tells us what the source is about. But we have noticed that there are so many of you who are too eager to start reading the source, and so you skip. You don't read the contextualization of the source, and then you go straight into the main body of the text, and sometimes we struggle to make meaning of it then. While we are reading our sources, we need to make sure that we are engaging with it. We can't just read the source at a surface level. We need to look for our definitions. So we need to underline the definitions, look for explanations and underline those as well. You can circle reasons. You need to look for different opinions. Remember earlier on I said history is also about studying multiple perspectives that might come across. So look out for that in the sources. Note who said what. Think about why they might have said something, and also note the similarities and differences that come up in our sources. I now want us to look at the contextualization of the source so that we can understand how much we can really learn by looking at the contextualization of the source. So if somebody asks me, what is the contextualization of the source? I say that it explains what the source is about. And that's so important for us when we want to find our answers. In front over here, I've pulled out the contextualization that appears in your telematics booklet, because I wanted us to understand the wealth of information that it gives us. So it says, source 1A. I'm going to just test my sound clip to see if it plays. If it doesn't play, then I will read it to you.
This is an extract from a speech delivered by Winston Churchill, the former Prime Minister of Britain, at Fulton, Missouri, in the United States, on the 5th of March, 1946. It called for a greater partnership between Britain and the United States of America to prevent Soviet expansion into Eastern Europe.
Okay, so grade 12s, before we even read the source, we have a very good understanding about what to expect in that source. So we know that it's a speech. We know that it's delivered by Winston Churchill. The contextualization tells us that he is the former Prime Minister of Britain. It also tells us that he delivers the speech in the United States of America. So even though he's not in his own country, he's delivering this speech in a country that supports the ideas of capitalism and democracy as well. All right? He also goes on in the source to give us a time period of when this happened. He delivers his speech on the 5th of March, 1946. In our next step now, we are actually going to listen to a section of the speech so that we can then go about answering some questions.
Source 1A. This is an extract from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic. An iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind the line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe. Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest and Sofia, all these famous cities and populations around them lie in the Soviet sphere, and all are subject in one form or another, not only to Soviet influence, but to a very high and increasing measure of control from Moscow. Athens alone, with its immortal glories, is free to decide its future at an election under British, American, and French observation. I reject the idea that a new war is inevitable, still more that it is imminent. It is because I am so sure that our fortunes are in our own hands and we hold the power to save the future that I feel a duty to speak now that I have an occasion to do so. I do not believe that Soviet Russia desires war. What they desire is the fruits of war and the indefinite expansion of their power and doctrines. From what I have seen of our Russian friends and allies during the war, I am convinced that there is nothing they admire so much as strength, and there is nothing for which they have less respect than for military weakness. If the Western democracies stand together in strict obedience to the principles of the United Nations Charter, their influence for furthering these principles will be immense, and no one is likely to molest them. If, however, they become divided or falter in their duty, and if these all-important years are allowed to slip away, then indeed catastrophe may overwhelm them.
So here we go. Here's our first question. At 1.1.1, we must define the term Iron Curtain in our own words. If we have a look at our mark allocation, you'll see that we need to provide one detailed response. And in return for our detailed response, grade 12s, the marker will award us with 2 marks. So we could say Winston Churchill warned that an Iron Curtain was dividing Europe into East and West. It was not a real curtain, but a symbolic line or border that divided communist Eastern Europe and democratic Western Europe. Right? And just like that, we will be awarded our 2 marks. We can move on to 1.1.2. Why did Churchill claim that the independence of Eastern Europe was under threat? Here again, you'll see our mark indication indicates that we need to answer one detailed fact, and in return for our detailed fact, the marker will award us with 2 marks. So we can say that Eastern European states were under the control of the Soviet Union's sphere of influence as satellite states, meaning that free and fair elections could not take place in these countries. Alright, you'll notice grade 12s that the answer isn't necessarily evident within the source. As a grade 12 history learner, I am expected to interpret the information that is presented in the source while making use of the information that I have studied and presented in this answer as well. Let's move on to 1.1.3 now. Here we need to explain what Churchill meant by the statement, what they desire is the fruits of war. And we are helped over here by being told that the they is the Soviet Union. The mark allocation is 2 times 2. So here we need to provide 2 detailed responses. And when we are providing these responses, as I've implied before, the answer isn't necessarily in the source straightforward. We need to be able to interpret our source and offer an explanation to the question. So in response to the question, we must explain what Churchill meant by the statement, what they desire is the fruits of war, we can say the Soviet Union wanted the gains, the benefits, that's the fruits. So a fruit in this context is not a literal fruit, rather it is the gains or the benefits of war that the winning country can claim, such as power and domination. They'd also be able to increase their sphere of influence. They wanted to keep the Eastern European countries that they helped liberate towards the end of World War II, and they wanted to use their resources as reparations to help rebuild their country and expand their communist sphere of influence. Grade 12, you'll notice that if you look at this answer, it requires quite a bit of prior knowledge from what we've actually studied. So this is the information that you need to bear in mind while you answer this question. We know that World War II was raging. We know that Germany had controlled quite a lot of the territories in Eastern Europe. As World War II progressed, Russia then went along with the Allied forces and liberated many of these countries in Eastern Europe. As they progressed and liberated the countries, Russia then took control of these countries. At the end of the war, there was lots of gripe around it because Russia wanted to influence and control those countries. They argued that they should be allowed to maintain the control of those countries because their country had been devastated by the effects of World War II. The infrastructure that had been built up during Stalin's reign through the implementation of the 5-year plans that promoted agricultural and industrial growth had been destroyed. And so Stalin's argument and the communist argument at the time was that they had to be compensated by means of controlling these states that they'd taken under their influence. So you'll see that very often we have learners who have this approach to simply saying that they don't need to study for a source-based section because all of the answers are in the source-based section, but that is not always the case. We know that there are a certain number of answers that we can find in our sources, usually our level 1 questions, where we simply need to extract information from the sources. But when we are dealing with sources that require us to explain and interpret, we need to have the skills where we are able to interpret what is happening in their source and explain it. And sometimes we need our prior knowledge from what we have studied in order to help us do that effectively. So please remember that as you prepare for formal assessments. All right, let's go on. At 1.1.4, it's our last one now, that deals with the origins of the Cold War. At 1.1.4, what actions did Churchill believe Western power should take to prevent the spread of Soviet influence in Europe? Watch the mark allocation over here. This time it's 2 times 1. That 2 times 1 indicates that we are going to offer 2 short responses, and in return for each of our short responses, we will be awarded 1 mark that will then total the 2 marks. So our responses simply are: Western democracies must work together, right? I think the source might make a reference to standing together, but we can say anything along the lines of Western democracies that must work together, that must be united, and then very importantly, they need to follow the principles of the United Nations Charter. Now, because the mark allocation is so brief, we don't necessarily need to explain what these principles are of the United Nations Charter. We can just say they must follow the principles of the United Nations Charter. From our studies, though, we know that when we are referring to the principles of the United Nations Charter, it refers to the right for every country to practice their self-determination, to choose the government and the mode of government that they want operating in the country. That brings us to the end of our section on the origins of the Cold War. We're now going to move on to looking at the extension and the expansion of the Cold War into Vietnam through the Vietnam War. This is going to be an essay section in our 2021 exams, grade 12s. So the extension of the Cold War, the Vietnam War. Right. When we have a look at our exam guidelines, we'll see that it's going to make reference to the fact that we need to understand the stages of the Vietnam War. Now, I want us to make sure that we are clear on the focus. I'm listening to learners, and I find that a lot of learners are thinking that they need to know all the details that start in the 1940s and the 1950s. Make sure that your focus area for this essay is focused on the period that we actually need to look at, which would relate to the stages of the Vietnam War. So if we have to look at the stages of the Vietnam War, I'd say we can divide it into 3 broad areas. The one area, the first one, would be the advisory role. The next broad stage would be the physical combat stage. And then the last stage will be the withdrawal. So if we have a look at those 3 stages, advisory, physical combat, and withdrawal, we are essentially going to look at the period from 1964 to 1975. And if we have a look at past question papers where this question has come up, you'll notice that the question generally asks us to look at the period from 1965 to 1975. So I think it's reasonable for us to focus our attention on these aspects in relation to the stages of the Vietnam War. So, you'll be expected to speak about the advisory role. That would be America's advisory role. But before you speak about the US military as advisors, you might want to offer some context. Here you can speak about the division of North Vietnam and South Vietnam. You might also want to speak about America's fear. So you see, I've actually put in a little domino over there to remind you about their fears with regards to the domino theory, that if one Asian country fell to communism, there would be a ripple effect, and other countries would also fall under communist threat. And so because of this fear, they go on to then offer US military advisory help. Then you're going to kick off the essay by talking about the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, when the American ships were attacked, or presumably attacked, in the Gulf of Tonkin. This then changes the nature and the stage within Vietnam, because now you are going to find that physical combat will take place because troops are sent. Here you need to speak about America's approach. You need to speak about Operation Rolling Thunder. You're going to go on to speak about Operation Ranch Hand. Then you are going to go on to offer details with regards to the Tet Offensive. But there are other aspects that you also need to include when you look at the physical combat section. You're going to go on to look at the growth of the anti-war movement, right? It starts in about 1965, and then you find that it peaks in 1968. We also need to have a look at the differing perspectives of war, how Vietnam's members of their nation were also involved in the war, and essentially how the countries view the war differently. So earlier on, even when we were talking about the Cold War and the origins of the Cold War, I spoke about the idea around multiple perspectives, and the Vietnam War is no different in that sense. On the one hand, you've got the USA, and I think to a great extent, if we look at it, for the USA, it's simply a matter of containing communism and making sure that communism can't spread in Asia. Whereas if you actually look at the Vietnamese people, it really becomes a matter of their right as a people to choose the kind of government that they want controlling them and ruling them. So the reason for the war, the reason why they are fighting is entirely different. Also, when you speak about the physical combat, not only must you mention America's initiatives, you need to keep the balance and then also speak about Vietnamese initiatives as well, and why America struggles so much within that Vietnam War. All right. Then we said the last phase that you need to look at is the withdrawal phase. So we look at the withdrawal phase. We're going to start it off in 1969, where America, under President Nixon at the time, says that they're going to start with the withdrawal of troops. You need to look at Vietnamization and the policies around that. Right. America says Vietnam needs to be able to stand on their own feet and basically fight off the communists without their intervention. Then you need to look at the period of the ceasefire that happens in 1953. And in all likelihood, you must end your essay in 1975, when we speak about the fact that in 1975, Saigon falls to communist North Vietnam. And we know that the fact that South Vietnam actually falls to communist North Vietnam is a poor reflection on the USA and the efforts within Vietnam. Essentially, we consider it a loss for the USA. In the last section today, I want us to have a look at the activity. Our activity in our telematics booklet says that we need to write introductions for the following essays. So first, we're going to start off by offering a reminder on how to write an introduction. So grade 12s, I can't emphasize enough. In 2020, we had lots of problems with learners writing. The exam report that actually came back from the National Senior Certificate exam says that we essentially need to ensure that learners are offering the essays in the correct format, that we need to pay attention to how learners approach the essay in the introduction, that learners must have a line of argument, and that learners also need to have a conclusion. It is not enough for you to simply study the content and then deliver it. There are lots of learners who think that or actually I don't really know what you're thinking, but I assume that you are working on the basis of if you have studied the content, that will be sufficient for you to excel in history. But it's not. We need to have an understanding of our content and then apply it, the application of that content knowledge to the questions that are posed. So in the last few minutes today, we're going to have a look at the 3 types of essay questions we can expect in a history assessment, and then we are going to look at how to approach writing an introduction. So we know that from grade 10 already you've been reminded about the 3 steps to writing a history introduction. I now want to take the opportunity to remind you about it. So our 3-step introduction. Step 1, we need to respond immediately to the question. We need to take a stance, tell the marker what our opinion is, and we can use various words or phrases to do this. An example where we take a stance might be that we introduce our essay by saying to a greater extent or to a lesser extent. Or you might say that you agree or disagree with a statement that is being posed. The next thing you need to do is explain why. You need to give a brief, quick reason on why you have chosen that standpoint. We find that we can use the crutch word because, indicating to the marker that we are going to give a reason for our stance that we've taken in step 1. And then lastly, for a good introduction, we need to make sure that we identify how we will prove our answer. And so we tell our marker that this essay will explain, and then we briefly tell the marker what we intend on discussing and explaining in our essay and examining. So, essay types of questions. Our first type of question, you'll see on the left hand side, I've said it relates to the fact that you are going to be given a statement, and then you will be asked whether you agree with that statement or not. You need to remember that you must take a stance. You must agree or disagree, and you need to use historical evidence to support your stance when you're answering this type of question. You usually start this essay off by saying that I agree, disagree, or partially agree. Also remember that that's the only time you're going to make reference to yourself when you say I agree, disagree, or partially agree. Otherwise, history writing is considered academic writing, right? And so we usually write in the third person. Here's an example of a question where you are given a statement and then asked if you agree or disagree with it. The question states, the withdrawal of soldiers from Vietnam signaled the defeat of the United States of America's policy of containment. Do you agree with the statement? You need to substantiate your answer using relevant evidence from the period 1965 to 1975. And the value of that is 50 marks. Now I'd like to show you what an example of introduction looks like when we apply the 3 steps for writing an introduction to the question that has been posed. So our response might look something like, I agree. The withdrawal of soldiers from Vietnam signaled the defeat of the policy of containment because the United States of America was unable to gain a clear victory in Vietnam, and communism had spread to many Eastern European and Asian countries. This essay discusses the various stages of the Vietnam War between 1965 and 1975. So you'll see, grade 12s, I've got 3 clear steps. 1, I've taken a stance. Then I made direct reference to the question and quote that had been given to me. Then I've provided the marker with a reason in order to support my stance. And then I point out to the marker how I will go about proving my stance. That I will discuss the various stages of the Vietnam War between 1965 and 1975. Alright? So now we're going to have a look at another type of essay question. This time we refer to it as the critically discuss. So, critically discuss or analyze. Here you need to provide arguments for and against. Grade 12s, I just want to remind you of this. We've got lots of learners who seem to think that when the question asks you to critically discuss, they are asking you to criticize. That is not the meaning of the word or the term critically discuss. When we are asked to critically discuss in history, we are asked to look at all facts and weigh up all facts. So when we are asked to critically discuss, you are going to take a stance and you are going to present your argument by presenting information for and against both sides. And then at the end of the essay, again in your conclusion, you can reiterate that all of the information, when weighed up, the positives, the negatives, the goods, the bads, they all then indicate that your stance has been proven and maintained. So please remember that about the question that relates to critically discussing and analyzing. An example of a question that deals with critically discussing or analyzing states that despite the deployment of troops or soldiers, arms and ammunition, the United States of America failed to prevent the spread of communism in Vietnam. It goes on. It says, critically discuss the validity of the statement with reference to the United States of America's involvement in the Vietnam War between 1965 and 1975. Also worth 50 marks. Here again, we've given you an introduction. Question on the left to remind you, and on the right, we've applied this information in our introduction. One can agree that despite American deployments, the USA failed to prevent the spread of communism in Vietnam. The withdrawal of soldiers from Vietnam signaled the defeat of the United States of America. This essay discusses the USA's involvement in the Vietnam War between 1965 and 1975. Then there's a last example that I'd like to show you. This time we have essay questions again, type 3, and it's the one where we are going to ask you to what extent. So the question is phrased and it will ask you to what extent do you agree, and you need to then respond by saying that you agree to a greater extent or you agree to a lesser extent. So the example that we've posed over here says, explain to what extent the USA was able to contain the spread of communism in Vietnam in the period 1965 to 1975. Here you can have a look at the introduction. On the left-hand side, we've posed the question, and then on the right, we offer you that introduction. It says, to a great extent, the USA was unable to contain the spread of communism in Vietnam because, in March 1975, Communist North Vietnam took control of Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam. This essay explains the USA's failed attempts to stop the spread of communism during the Vietnam War from 1965 to 1975. All right, so with that, grade 12s, we explained 3 types of essay questions, and we've also given you examples on how to write your introduction. We don't have time today to go into more detail around line of argument or writing conclusions, but we'll focus on that in another session when you join us for telematics. So today, I sincerely hope that you found the session interesting, that you were able to make notes and get a better understanding of our subject, because our aim for 2021 is to master our subject and produce the best results we can in our final exams. Thank you for joining us today, grade 12s.